My name is Jacob Lassner, and as the co-convener of this conference, I have the happy task of welcoming you all to this, the initial session of 2 days of scheduled talks and discussions on the histories of Jerusalem, past, present, and future. This conference was stimulated by a path-breaking international conclave at Northwestern, which was held in April of 2003, a conclave that dealt broadly with the residual effects of the past on the current Arab-Israeli problem. Moving from the general to the specific, this year we will trace the history by which Jerusalem, and especially the so-called Temple Mount, or Noble Sanctuary as it is known to Muslims, came to be considered sacred space within the configuration of the Holy Land. We have also to consider the political ramifications of declaring Jerusalem a place of special importance not only for Jews, Christians, and Muslims when they confront one another, but also when they confront their fellow co-religionists. If nothing else, by the time our deliberations are over, both the participants and the audience will come to realize that the history of Jerusalem is far more complex than many are wont to imagine at the present. As such, adjudicating current disputes concerning the city are also likely to be more complex than some are wont to imagine. I hope that by the time we are finished here, we shall have a better historical context with which to address one of the most compelling and complex issues before all of us who hope for a better world in the Near East. At this particular moment, I would like to turn the microphone over to Eliay of Ben-Gurion University, who will serve as the chair of the session, replacing Dan Reisman, who at last notice was in Dublin enjoying the fine weather, having been told that it's still cold here in Chicago. So, with no further ado, I'm going to ask Eliay to chair the session.
Thank you, Jack. I think I was asked to replace the gentleman who's in Ireland is because I've come the farthest, and to make sure to justify the long trip. Thank you for the distinction. Last night at the opening meeting for the conference, we heard from the dean and from Benjamin Sommer, who's the director of the Crown Center program here, about the appropriateness of holding a conference in Jerusalem at a university, and in particular this university. I would only add that I spent a part of my life at another university south of the Loop, where I did graduate work, and that I would occasionally go on Friday afternoons into the city to escape, if you like, the intensity of that particular place. And one of the places that one can visit in the center of Chicago is the Chicago Tribune building. I don't necessarily urge you to purchase the newspaper, but the facade of the building is interesting. For in the building are embedded stones. And among the stones, the Great Wall of China, and what other wall do you think is represented in the Chicago Tribune building? Of course, it's a piece of the stone of the Wall of Jerusalem. So that the connections between Jerusalem and the imagination of peoples throughout the world, as well as the people of Chicago, are well established and indeed set in stone. It's to the stones and imagination that we're to turn today, and we begin with history. Before we get to the future, although this conference is called The Histories of the Future, and maybe what we can come away with when this is all done is a keener sense for what that future history might be and how it might be shaped. I would, not to steal the thunder and the meaning of people who are far better equipped than I to deal with the history of the city, I would only comment to you as someone who does deal with the way in which contemporary scholarship about Israel is shaped, is that one of the most fascinating topics is the history of Jerusalem. On the one side, there are those people who deny it, who would argue that Jerusalem was just a small, insignificant town, really a figment of the imagination as it developed perhaps in the 7th or 8th century BC. But the historic Jerusalem is a place whose, like Mark Twain would have us believe, is a truth much imagined, much invented. Then, of course, there are those who take their epistemology not from archaeology, not from biblical scholarship, but who take it from divine inspiration, and they would argue that our perception of the city is not sufficiently large, that there is a heavenly city and that there is the city, the unheavenly city. Between the epistemology of the believer and the epistemology of the scientist or contemporary scientist, there's a world of scholarship, and it is really to that world of scholarship that we're going to begin. And the place to begin with the history of the scholarship in the city of Jerusalem is to begin with the way in which Jerusalem was defined, evolved, imagined by Jews. For the sources of our pleasures and the sources of our troubles regarding Jerusalem really begin with the Jews, for it is they who begin the imagining and the debate about what that city is and what that city means. There's no better person and place to begin with than the director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish Studies and our very gracious host in these proceedings, and that's with Professor Benjamin Sommer, who also went to a school south of the Loop and is occasionally associated with it, as he is with the Hebrew University and a variety of other distinguished institutions. But his most distinguished affiliation is here as a scholar who deals with the Bible, the ancient Near East, texts, exegesis. Among his many contributions and the ways in which he's acknowledged is that he's currently the editor for the Jewish Publication Society's Bible Commentary Series for the Book of Psalms, and he won the important Salo Baron Prize for A Prophet Reads Scripture, allusion to Isaiah 40 to 66. A very productive, very active, and very, as we're all going to find out again, a very articulate scholar. Professor Sommer.
Thank you, Elon. When Jack Lassner first asked me to give a paper for this conference on the historical controversies relating to Jerusalem in biblical studies, I must confess that my first reaction was amusement. What historical controversies? Historians, archaeologists, and textual scholars have plenty to talk about regarding biblical Jerusalem, but none of their discussions seem to have any bearing on the topics to be addressed in this conference. To be sure, I am aware of the fact that Chairman Arafat has cast doubt on the Jewish people's connection to the city of Jerusalem, denying that a Jewish temple had existed on what is known in Hebrew as Har Habayit, or the Temple Mount, and in Arabic as Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary. Nevertheless, archaeological and textual data utilized by modern academics agree with Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition that the ancient Judean temple was in fact located on a particular hill, located just north and west of the Kidron Valley and immediately east and north of the Tyropaean Valley, that is to say, on the hill known as the Haram al-Sharif or Har Habayit. That Chairman Arafat excludes the testimony of Jewish and Christian lore is perhaps to be expected. That he ignores the fields of archaeology and historical geography is not especially surprising. That he disregards the witness of Muslim doctrine on this point is a rather fascinating phenomenon that deserves comment, but a fascinating phenomenon that is quite removed from the discussions that go on in the various fields of biblical criticism, which I am competent to address. In short, there are no controversies in modern scholarship relevant to our proceedings today and tomorrow. But this does not mean that such controversies as do occur among biblicists might not be misunderstood to pertain to contemporary issues. With this in mind, I would like this morning to describe a few debates among modern scholars and to note why they are irrelevant for our concerns. Certainly the most prominent of the debates that one would expect to hear discussed in relation to the political ramifications of contemporary Jerusalem involves the work of the so-called minimalist biblical scholars, also known as the Copenhagen School. These scholars specifically Thomas Thompson and Niels Peter Lemke of the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, and Keith Whitlam and Philip Davies of the University of Sheffield in England, have suggested that virtually all the texts found in the Hebrew Bible were written in the Persian and Hellenistic periods. That is to say, in the 5th through roughly the 1st centuries BCE, long after most other scholars, really all other scholars, think that they were written. They deny that the nations Israel and Judah, in anything approximating the biblical sense of these terms, ever existed in the Iron Age, that is, prior to the 6th century BCE. The reports regarding these kingdoms, their culture, their leaders, their inhabitants, are, according to the Copenhagen School, largely fictional creations of writers living in Persian and Hellenistic Judah. These relatively late writers, who are responsible for the Hebrew Bible, intended to create a new ethnicity. Consequently, they found it necessary to fashion a fictive past in order to justify their political claims to the area around Jerusalem and to justify their religious claims to authority. If this is the case, then there was no Davidic monarchy, there was no Solomonic temple in Jerusalem, indeed, there was no David and no Solomon. For two reasons, the minimalists' claims are irrelevant to our concerns. The first reason involves the nature of the modern political debate in regard to the existence of a Jewish state. The second involves the nature of the debate concerning ancient Israel. To begin with the first of these, one can imagine that opponents of Israeli claims to Jerusalem, indeed opponents to the very idea of a Jewish state, might want to use the work of the Copenhagen School to undermine the claim of Jews to Jerusalem or of any land in the Middle East whatsoever. In fact, however, it seems to me that the work of the Copenhagen School cannot plausibly be used in this way. After all, even the minimalists acknowledge that a Jewish ethnicity did exist in antiquity, centered around the temple community in Jerusalem, particularly in Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman Jerusalem. The minimalists don't deny that an independent Jewish commonwealth existed in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE with its capital in Jerusalem. What they do claim is that the political, ethnic, and religious groups associated with the terms Judaism, Jew, Israelite, and the like came into existence much later than anyone heretofore suspected. Now, the basic ideology of the Zionist movement, whether one accepts that ideology or reviles that ideology, is that the Jewish people have a right to statehood in their ancient homeland. As the first sentence of the Israeli Declaration of Independence puts it, the Jewish people came into existence in the land of Israel. There, its national, religious, and cultural identities were formed. When this happened is incidental to Zionism's claims. After all, the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel does not state the Jewish people came into existence in the land of Israel during the Middle Bronze Age, and if it happened any later than that, forget it, let's call the whole thing off, we're going back to Poland. Whatever the merits of the minimalists' proposals, I cannot see how these proposals have any relevance to the basic claims of the Zionist movement or to contemporary debates between two peoples with genuine and long-standing claims to the same piece of territory. To claim that Jewish nationhood is a product of the 4th century BCE rather than, say, the 10th century BCE, and that, therefore, it doesn't count as nationhood at all, is as ridiculous a red herring as the often heard claim that Palestinian national consciousness is a product of the early 20th century and therefore is not a national consciousness at all. The reason is completely specious. When a nation becomes a nation, is of no relevance to the rights of that nation, and hence the work of the minimalists has no bearings on contemporary political concerns. It makes no difference whether the Jewish people came into existence in the Middle Bronze Age, the Iron Age, or the Hellenistic era. There is furthermore a second reason that the minimalists' claims ought to have no bearing on a discussion about Jerusalem. The minimalists present bold and original proposals vitiated by only one failing: the complete unanimity of textual, linguistic, comparative, and archaeological evidence against their proposals. A few years ago, the Crown Center here at Northwestern sponsored a conference on the minimalists, and as a young faculty member, I pointed out that if we were holding such a conference, we had to invite some minimalists to present their arguments. I had been at too many conferences at which speaker after speaker ridiculed the viewpoints of this school without any response from the people, from people who thought that there might be something to defend in the work of this school. If we were going to invite speakers who would critique the work of the minimalists, then we would have to allow other speakers to come defend it as well. Thus it then fell to me to find a scholar in North America, that is, within a decent airfare of O'Hare or Midway, who would agree to come and defend some aspect of the minimalist work. To make a long story short, we ended up having to bring two scholars from Copenhagen. I cannot think of a single scholar on this continent, in Europe or in Israel, other than members of the Sheffield and Copenhagen faculties and their graduate students who have accepted their claims. The most that can be said is that some archaeologists find the minimalist work on historiography fascinating while noting that they completely misrepresent the archaeological data. Some historians find their suggestions regarding the development of the Hebrew language interesting, while noting that their use of historical narratives is extremely weak. Comparative scholars find the remarks on matters archaeological clever and innovative, while noting that they base central conclusions of theirs on specious comparisons to Greek literature, while minimizing points of contact with Babylonian and Assyrian literature, which seriously undermine their claims. If the minimalist's thesis has some small degree of probability, then everything archaeologists know about epigraphy, paleography, and stratigraphy is wrong. Everything specialists in Northwest Semitic languages know about the history of the Hebrew language, and indeed everything theoretical linguists know about the field of historical linguistics, is wrong. Most of what we suspect about the nature of ancient historical narratives is wrong, and the many points of contact among ancient Akkadian and Israelite texts are illusions. Now, it is of course possible that all the findings of modern scholarship relating to the ancient Near East are somehow false. But if someone wants to make such a claim, if someone really wants to support that assertion, that person must provide evidence and an explanation for this surprising situation. And the minimalists simply have not done so. Their work, in my judgment, is no more relevant to the modern academic study of ancient Israel than, say, Michael Grosman's recent book, The Bible Codes. I think we can move on to more serious matters. A second and much more serious debate that concerns the history of Jerusalem is the recent controversy regarding the dating of the United Monarchy and the reign of King Solomon. You may recall that according to biblical texts, according specifically to the books of Samuel and Kings, a man named Saul first brought the various Israelite tribes into a unified kingdom in roughly the 11th century BCE. He was succeeded by a man named David, and David by David's son Solomon. The Book of Kings tells us that Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem in the mid-10th century BCE and constructed fortresses and monumental buildings throughout his realm. After Solomon's death, this large and impressive kingdom split into two parts. The southern kingdom, called Judah, continued to be ruled by David's descendants from their capital in Jerusalem. The northern and much larger kingdom was called Israel. This, in brief, is the biblical version of the story. In the middle of the last century, a consensus emerged among biblical archaeologists that evidence had been found for the existence of the United Monarchy in the 10th century, that is, for the existence of a monarchy under King Solomon that involved both northern Israel and southern Judah. That is, in the 10th century, precisely when Solomon is supposed to have lived. In several locations, most prominently the cities of Megiddo, Chatzor, and Gezer, archaeologists discovered monumental fortifications that follow a single architectural plan. That is, in Megiddo, Chatzor, and Gezer, the fortifications all follow the same blueprint, so to speak. The scholars who dug at these locations dated these consistent fortifications to the 10th century BCE based on the evidence of stratigraphy, pottery finds, and artifacts. The Israeli archaeologist Yigal Yadin declared these fortifications evidence of the Solomonic building program described in the Book of Kings, which in fact does specify Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer as cities fortified by Solomon's massive corvée labor campaign. The single plan that all these fortifications display, in particular the six-chambered gateway found in the walls of each city, indicates that a centralized authority was consolidating its position throughout the land of Canaan by constructing a series of walls in strategic locations. The Bible asserts that Solomon did just that. And because archaeologists identified the pottery and stratigraphy of the gates in Megiddo, Hatzor, and Gezer as belonging to the 10th century, it seemed clear that the Bible and the archaeological record both attest to the massive building campaign of Solomon, a campaign that also included the temple in Jerusalem. More recently, however, two archaeologists have cast serious doubt on this older consensus. Israel Finkelstein and David Usishkin, colleagues of our friend Eliay from Tel Aviv University, argue that the six-chambered gateways in these three cities do not, in fact, date to the 10th century. On the basis of a painstaking analysis of stratigraphy and pottery and other artifacts, they date the crucial walls to the 9th century BCE rather than the 10th century. If this is so, then we may still have evidence of a centralized ruler asserting influence over a wide area. But that ruler is not Solomon, and the kingdom in question is not the united monarchy of Judah and Israel. Rather, we have evidence of the rise of an independent northern kingdom of Israel a century later than the time allegedly of Solomon. Now, Finkelstein's findings do not in themselves show that David and Solomon are mythical figures, and in fact Finkelstein himself stresses that other evidence makes it very likely that a king named David really did found a dynasty that ruled over Judah. But the datings Finkelstein and Usishkin propose do make clear that the Book of Kings' picture of Solomon as a great builder is not accurate. Is the work of Finkelstein and Usishkin relevant to our concerns? The many archaeologists who continue to maintain the older consensus would probably argue that it is not, simply because it is wrong. But what of those archaeologists, and there are serious archaeologists, who think it is a correct dating of the materials? One might want to suggest the following line of reasoning. Finkelstein and Usishkin show that the biblical Solomon the great builder, did not exist. Ergo, there was no Solomonic temple, and perhaps no Solomon. Ergo, there was no ancient Israelite or Judean temple in the biblical period, and this would be, in fact, perhaps relevant to our discussion, a person might want to suggest. Now, in the first place, again, I don't see how this conclusion really would be relevant to our discussion at all. The existence of a Jewish temple in the Second Temple period would still not be in doubt. That is, in the Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman period would still not be in doubt. Moreover, it is necessary to note the jumps of logic in the reasoning I just described. That Solomon did not build the grand fortifications in Megiddo, Hatzor, and Gezer does not necessarily show that he did not build in Jerusalem. Much more importantly, even if he did not build a temple in Jerusalem, indeed, even if he never existed, there is no reason to doubt that some other, later member of the Davidic dynasty did build such a temple, unless one wants to assume that ancient Judah was the one nation in the ancient Near East without a central national sanctuary. Can the genuine controversy over the nature and even existence of a Solomonic monarchy be made to seem relevant to contemporary political concerns? The answer to this question is yes, if one is willing to summarize the debate very selectively and then to use faulty logic to explore some possible consequences of the selectively presented facts. I hasten to add, incidentally, that this debate is altogether separate from the debate regarding the minimalists. Finkelstein and Usishkin are serious scholars, and even those who vigorously disagree with their findings acknowledge that their contributions are genuine and well-researched academic writing. For some reason, Finkelstein in particular has been lumped together with the minimalists, though his conclusions differ very considerably from theirs. Finkelstein argues that the biblical picture of David and Solomon attributes to them real events, to wit, the establishment of a strong, unified Israelite state, that occurred a century after they in fact died. The minimalists, on the other hand, deny that these events really ever occurred. Finkelstein argues that the Israelites as an ethnicity begin to come into existence, or at least begin to be recognizable in the archaeological record, during the 13th or 12th centuries BCE, and that the Israelites' political entities come into existence in the 9th century BCE. The minimalists, on the other hand, deny that there ever were Israelites in anything vaguely approaching the biblical sense of the term during the 12th, 13th, or even the 6th century BCE, and that anything resembling the Judeans came into existence for the first time in the very late century, the 6th century BCE. These are very, very different kinds of reasoning, and how exactly Finkelstein has ended up being lumped together with the minimalists is somewhat beyond me. One other debate concerning Jerusalem in the biblical period that deserves some mention is the location of Solomon's temple, or if you prefer to speak a bit more accurately, the location of the temple, of the ancient Judean temple that was attributed, rightly or wrongly, to King Solomon. No archaeological digs can take place, of course, on the Haram al-Sharif or Har Habayit, and even if they did take place, it is doubtful that any remains from the first temple would exist. Any identifiable indicators of the more ancient structures atop the hill in question would have been removed not only by the destruction wrought by the Babylonian army in the early 6th century, but also by the building of the second temple in the later 6th century, and most of all by the highly extensive rebuilding of that temple, and in fact rebuilding of the entire Temple Mount platform, by King Herod in the 1st century BCE. The destruction of Herod's temple by Roman legions under Titus' command in the year 70 CE would not help matters for archaeologists either, as far as finding remains of the first temple goes. But based on textual descriptions in the Bible and the ancient Jewish historian Josephus, and based on stray geographic information, especially the extensive observation of British soldiers named Sir Charles Warren and Charles Wilson made in the 1860s and 1870s CE, it is possible to speculate on the location of the temple and its various rooms and subparts. Suffice it to say that many scholars have suggested that the temple was located where the Dome of the Rock currently stands. A few maintain that it was located further south, where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located, and a few, including especially a scholar named Asher Kaufman, argue that it stood slightly north of the Dome of the Rock, where the Kubat al-Alua, or Chapel of the Spirits, now stands. A prominent German biblical scholar, Rainer Alberts, argues strongly for the last of these proposals, that the temple was north of the Dome of the Rock, and comments, "The recognition that the Jewish temple did not lie directly on the second holiest place in Islam could facilitate a balance between the two rival religions in Jerusalem in the future." Alberts is a fine biblical scholar, but alas for the naivete of that comment. I shall close by addressing more directly the question of whether Solomon might have in fact built the Judean temple, not because it is in fact relevant to contemporary political concerns, but because, having raised the question, I may have tickled the curiosity of some people who are in the room. Of course, as I've mentioned, no real archaeological evidence can become available regarding this question, regarding whether Solomon built the temple. Digs have never been carried out on the Temple Mount, none is foreseeable, and the relevant evidence would probably have been erased by Nebuchadnezzar, Zerubbabel, Herod, and Titus millennia ago. And even if remains were found, it's not clear that they would necessarily have Solomon's name on them. To be sure, a few artifacts have been discovered as a result of construction activity by the Muslim Waqf responsible for the Muslim holy sites on the Temple Mount or on the Noble Sanctuary Mount. But these artifacts are of limited use to scholars, since they do not come from supervised archaeological digs. They usually come to scholars' attention through antiquities dealers, not through thorough scientific digging in supervised digs. This poses two problems. First, their authenticity cannot be verified. This is the case, for example, with the famous Yehoash inscription, alleged to have been found only a few years ago. It was is now widely considered to be a forgery, at least by most Israeli scholars. Some non-Israeli scholars and non-Jewish scholars in particular, such as David Noel Friedman and André Lemaire, still claim that it may be a real find, but they are by now very much in the minority. Second, even if an artifact that appears on the antiquities market is genuine, we have no way of knowing where it was found, what its context was, what its strata was. Archaeologists are not terribly interested in mere artifacts, things brought up out of the ground. Rather, archaeologists are interested in the relation of an artifact to its setting, the relation of the artifact to its strata, knowing where in a mound it was found, what it was near. Knowing about its setting, its strata, its context, is what allows archaeologists to read an artifact, to figure out what the artifact tells us about the ancient world. Hence, we cannot expect that archaeological finds that come to our attention through antiquities dealers are likely to help us decide, at least likely to give us a whole lot of good information on whether Solomon built Solomon's temple or someone else did. Surprisingly, however, some textual data from the Bible itself may be relevant in this regard. 1 Kings chapter 6 contains a long, fairly detailed description of the construction of Solomon's temple in the 10th century BCE. A German scholar named Konrad Ruprecht provided a tantalizing analysis of this material nearly 30 years ago. Ruprecht points out that the initial verses of this chapter, 1 Kings chapter 6, describe only the construction of several extensions. Yitziyah is the Hebrew word, or Yatsua is the Hebrew word. There are two versions of the text. The text describes only several extensions and windows that surround the main temple building. Much attention is subsequently devoted in this account to furnishings that were built for the internal rooms of the temple. But what is lacking is any lengthy description of the construction of the main building itself. Whereas ancient Near Eastern royal inscriptions often emphasize the firm foundation and strong walls that a king had built for a temple, this account never mentions foundations and speaks of the walls only in passing. And it doesn't even give the outside dimensions of those walls, though it does give the inside dimensions of the rooms. Further, the biblical text in question takes the trouble to inform us that the noisiest work, involving hammers and axes used on stone or wood, did not take place in the temple precincts themselves. The 7th verse of this chapter assures us that no hammers or axes were heard in the temple during the construction. From all this, Ruprecht concludes that this account in the Book of Kings is not really an account of the building of a temple at all, but rather an account of its renovation. The addition of extra rooms, the need now for new windows since the older walls were now interior walls, the fact that there was concern about noise inside the temple itself, all this seems to indicate that a temple already stood on this site and that Solomon merely added to an already existing structure. Here we need to recall that Solomon's father, David, is said to have conquered Jerusalem, which had until then been under the control of a group of Canaanites known as the Jebusites. Ruprecht suggests, therefore, that rather than building a new shrine de novo, Solomon merely added to an existing Jebusite sanctuary. In light of Ruprecht's proposal, it is interesting to recall the speculation of some other biblical scholars regarding the high priest Tzadok, from whom all subsequent high priests up until the Hasmonean or Maccabean period were descended. Tzadok was the first chief priest under the rule of David and Solomon, and hence the first chief priest or high priest to officiate in Solomon's temple. According to some modern biblical scholars, Tzadok may originally have been a Jebusite priest, that is, a non-Israelite priest who was already in Jerusalem officiating at a temple before David conquered the city. Upon David's conquest of the city, according to these scholars, Tzadok was simply added to King David's payroll. The name Tzadok, after all, was associated with pre-Davidic Canaanite Jerusalem already. We know of a king named Melchizedek in Jerusalem from the book of Genesis, and of a king named Adonai-Tzedek from the book, a Canaanite king named Adonai-Tzedek in Jerusalem from the book of Joshua. If Solomon did not build a temple, but expanded an already existing Jebusite temple, then the role of the formerly Canaanite, now Judean priest Tzadok, who had a good Jerusalemite Canaanite name is now much more understandable. Now, how does all this relate to the question of Solomon's temple and its historicity? It has become common among biblical scholars, not just the minimalists, but real biblical scholars, to regard many historical accounts depicting the early stages of Judean and Israelite history as fictions. These accounts are thought to have been created by whole cloth by later writers. These accounts are thought to have been created whole cloth by later writers, and hence they are not thought to contain any reliable historical data. However, it is fascinating at times to note a disconnect between a biblical text's main point or thesis on the one hand and the data presented to support or explain that main point on the other hand. This is a phenomenon, incidentally, that many of us who teach undergrads are very used to, that the thesis of the paper and the data just don't quite fit together. Now, precisely such a disconnect seems to occur not only in many papers that I grade, but in the account that I just described to you. In the account of, see one of my students back there grinning, papers due on Monday, of course. Hope they had this on mine. Precisely such a disconnect seems to occur in the account of the building of Solomon's temple as Ruprecht understands it. The Book of Kings claims to give the story of how Solomon built a new structure to serve the cult of a basically new religion. But the data embedded in this text may in fact describe a renovation of an existing structure. Now, if a writer were making up this story entirely, there would be no reason that the data in the story should not fit the storyteller's thesis perfectly. The very fact that the data and the thesis don't match each other strongly suggests that the data is good data. That is, that this chapter preserves genuine information about Solomon's work on the temple. In other words, it may be precisely the fact that the account in the Book of Kings is tendentious and in some ways unreliable that attests to the general believability of the story that it is telling. This chapter probably does preserve a record of temple construction by Solomon, albeit on a relatively small scale, and in a manner that made the editor of the Book of Kings somewhat uncomfortable. If Ruprecht's understanding of the text is correct, I should stress that it is not accepted by all biblical scholars by any means, then we can accept with some confidence the Bible's claim that the first temple was already in use by Judeans and Israelites as early as the 10th century. Some of those Judeans, interestingly enough, were almost certainly former Canaanites. I've attempted to give a sense of how biblical scholars talk about the city of Jerusalem. I hope that it's been clear from my brief presentation how the questions that scholars address are of little relevance to contemporary political concerns. They do not call into question the deep connection of Jews to the city of Jerusalem, and for that matter, they do not call into question the deep connection of Muslims or Christians to that city either. Of course, these debates, summarized briefly and selectively, may be misunderstood in such a way as to seem relevant to our current questions. It is worthwhile taking the time to recognize such misunderstandings for what they are. Thank you.
I must say that I'm very impressed by the students at Northwestern whose data is accurate if their conclusions are faulty. I can tell you that at Brandeis, where I sometimes teach, the conclusions are invariably correct. It's the data that's questionable. Thank you for getting us into the discussion. Just an anecdote about scholarship and politics. Shortly after the State of Israel was created, and the United Nations wanted to continue to insist on internationalization, the response of the Israeli political establishment was to have a celebration of the 3,000th anniversary of the founding of Jerusalem. I'm happy to say that at that time, scholars were informed by people like Ben Sommer, and they refused to participate in creating the illusion that the city was 3,000 years old. However, some of you may know that celebration was held a few years ago with the same questionable scholarship. So politics someplace does get involved in this issue. We're going to move along according to the following ground rules. Is that after the next presentation, we will have an 8-minute break for coffee, which will be rigorously enforced by Jack Lassner, not by me. And then we will go to the third presentation, and at that time, we will have questions, observations placed to the papers. The next paper takes us up from the biblical period and from the attempt to prove the historical veracity of these events to the imagination. And the imagination is expressed in tradition. The person who will do that for us is someone who actually comes from Jerusalem, Yaron Eliay, who is presently stationed at Michigan as the Jean and Samuel Professor for Rabbinic Literature in the Department of Near Eastern Studies, and whose specialty is the Greco-Roman period in Palestine, and along the way has written a book coming out now by Johns Hopkins University Press entitled God's Mountain, the Temple Mount in Time, Space, and Memory. And it is related to that work that we shall hear him speak on the Temple and the Temple Mount in Jewish tradition. Professor Eliay.
Thank you, Yaron. And since I will be using both slides and an overhead projection, I'll give an opportunity to those who perhaps want to move there, if they want to break their necks, and the whole discussion will be over because people will be going to the hospital. So if you wish to do that, and while you do, let me say that the rabbis who I study recommend to us Potchim b'shevach ha'achsania, which is basically a recommendation to open one's discussion with a few words of praise to the hospitality of the people who invited you. So let me start with that and express my thanks to both Professor Lassner and to the Northwestern Center for inviting me. I'm one of those scholars that it didn't cost a lot to bring, as Benjamin said, since it's only a flight from Detroit. However, there's a price you pay for that, which leads me to my second point, that I need to apologize that after this session I have to run back to teach. You see, if you would bring me from Copenhagen, I wouldn't be able to do that. But since it's only an hour flight, I came late last night from teaching, and I still have some teaching obligations today, and unfortunately I will not be able to participate in this fascinating discussion. Hopefully it will be printed and coming out as well. Okay, with that, let me move to my discussion itself. And just a few words before I start with the slides. Space constitutes a fundamental dimension of human experience. Nations inhabit countries, tribes dwell in territories, families inherit estates, and individuals constantly engage the endless corners that fuse into one's life. The bridge under which one first kissed, the stream by which she contemplated her options, the tree where they engraved their names, the tower, the intersection of roads, and so on. As always, social dynamics provide the interaction between people and places with substance, elevating some localities, denouncing others, and producing in the process the textures, both physical, such as architecture, and non, such as literature, folklore, or heritage, that shapes the way a certain space registers in our minds. Religion furnished the discourse on space with the incandescent language and imagery of holiness. Religion has always been inseparable from holy and sacred sites. One of the most famous among the sacred spaces is a flat, trapezoidal, walled compound located on the eastern edge of Jerusalem's Old City, and I will show you that compound very shortly. This compound is, the name of that compound is commonly translated in English as the Temple Mount. The literal translation, English here, is the literal translation of the original Hebrew, but not in an accurate way. The Hebrew goes ha-habayit, which probably should be translated as mount of the house. And we will come to the significance of that change in and through my presentation. Ancient Near Eastern monotheistic religions, Judaism and Islam in particular, but also Christianity, as we shall see, still revere the site as holy. And the faithful are careful to this very day to observe their special religious strictures and practices. The Temple Mount's importance, however, has long gone beyond its specifically religious significance. Over the years, it has been transformed into a national, cultural, and political symbol, deeply entrenched in the foundation of both Jewish, Zionist, and Arab Muslim Palestinian ethos. Poets have elegized it, writers have extolled it in essays and stories. The Mount has inspired spiritual leaders and generated countless images for artists from many varied schools and traditions. At the same time, it has cost political leaders many a sleepless night. In my paper today, which I'm about to present here, I will not discuss the whole story of the Temple Mount in the ancient world. And this is for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, as you heard, I toiled for a few years and wrote a whole book on this topic, which is coming out, and I definitely would like all of you to purchase. So if I give you all the crux of the matters here, what will you have to read? But jokes aside, and my publisher doesn't know that I'm here at all, the matter is just too complicated to address in one presentation, and indeed I did write 350 pages in press about it. So I will limit myself today to two issues. A, I'd like to ask a very simple question, which will turn out to be not as simple as it sounds, which is, what is the Temple Mount? How do we describe it? And B is the question of how, and rather why, did the Temple Mount come to be one of the most renowned sacred spaces of the Middle East, and to many, a notorious emblem of its raptured civilizations? Now, to answer these questions, at least from my point of view and by my methodology, we must actually leave modern politics behind and travel back in time to what many consider to be the cradle of Western civilization, that is the Roman and the early Byzantine Near East. So I do catalog myself under those irrelevant research topics that Benjamin Sommer has said for the present discussion, not because I think it's irrelevant, but just that I'm not so sure how it's relevant. And I think different people would take my work in different ways, which is completely fair. And I have no problem about that whatsoever. But as for myself, I just prefer, as someone who was raised and born in Israel, to leave myself out of that discussion and just concentrate in delivering my thoughts and the products of my work to you on these issues. So with no further ado, let's address these two questions through seeing some slides. So please, let's have the first slide. Now, if it's possible, I would take as much of the lights out so people can see. If it's up to me, and I'm fine with what I have, because I think no one can see practically anything. Do you see something? Is there a way to shut the lights down at all? Oh, wonderful. Filming. Well, you see, I have to give up something. So here we go. Is it clear? Okay, good. So, what is the Temple Mount? Is my first question. Well, if you look at the original word, habayit, the house, we've heard about the house, obviously here referring not to a specific house, but to the house of God. That is a temple, and more accurately, two temples. That tradition and historians agree, and we've heard all about it in the previous presentation, there were temples on a certain piece of land in Jerusalem. We're taking a look here. This is the old city of Jerusalem. We're looking east, the Judean desert up here, and the Temple Mount, the unit which I will be discussing right now, is this unit right here, east of the city of Jerusalem. This is, of course, the Kubbat, the Kubbat Etzlacha, the Dome of the Rock today, which is out the chronological limits of this discussion. I'm going to the earliest phase. But when people speak of the Temple Mount, Ha-Habayit, they talk about this structure right here, including, we're going to take a closer look in a second. Before I go on, I'm just taking one thing out of the discussion, which is the house. The house, which I will come to back later, is the temples. It's not one house, it's two or perhaps three, as we heard. Temples that were built by Israelite and then Jewish nations, groups who lived in Palestine in the first millennia and then in the hundreds of years after the beginning of the Common Era. And those are the temple. Those are the temples behind the main house. The mount, which is what I'm concerned with, the har, is this unit right here. And the one thing you should see already from this picture is that there is actually no mount whatsoever. Because if you take a look at the picture, you see that actually this space here is a very low space, relatively speaking, within the topography of Jerusalem. The mountains are here. This is the Mount of Olives, Mount Scopus, right here. Right here, this is a range of hills. And even if when you go closer to Jerusalem, this is a very high hill, much higher than this hill. And ancient Jerusalem, the city of the supposedly David and Solomon, which we heard about, was located somewhere here underneath. But mostly, people who lived in ancient Jerusalem would, when they go to the mountain, would actually descend and not ascend. If a Jew lived here, and most Jews lived during the Second Temple period here, they would actually go down to the Temple Mount. If they came from the north, as many, the only place in Jerusalem where you climb to this structure is if you lived down here in what is called the Davidic city, perhaps, or the lower city of the Second Temple period. So you see already that the image of a mountain within that framework is rather problematic. Let's take a closer look. Now the question is, how do I do this? Let's try and pray simultaneously. It's not working, so wait. Nope. Oh, I touched basically everything. Oh, you see it's not the right one. All right, so here we are taking a look at Jerusalem in a snowish picture that is not very common. But you see again, if this is the structure, we're here looking at Jerusalem from today's current Christian quarter, which was the part of the higher city of Jerusalem in the Second Temple period. And you can see, the reason I'm bringing this is to show you the relative lack of a mountain within the topographical framework. You see a mountain here, you see some elevation, although the picture doesn't capture that here, and you can see that this is a flat, you can't see that it's in the shape of a trapezoid, but it's a flat architectural unit that is called the Temple Mount. So where is the mount? Take another look. Same look, just to make the same point here, but here you can see how flat the unit is. These walls that created the unit, and I will talk about that in a second, are rather ancient, at least the line of the walls. They were rebuilt throughout the centuries, but the foundations are very ancient and go all the way back to the person responsible for the creation of this unit, which is part of my question. What is the Temple Mount? Answer: the Temple Mount is an architectonic unit, which is actually not a mount at all. Definitely not topographically speaking. And this mount was built, mount quote unquote, was built by a Jewish, or at least half Jewish king, a client of the Romans in the 1st century before the Common Era, by the name of Herod. Let's leave the picture for a second and see the first transparent projection, just to give you a sense of the topography of Jerusalem as well. Here's a map. Nope, that's absolutely right. Here's a map of Jerusalem's topography. All the pictures are, by the way, restricted only to my book. That's why I can't have the photograph, and no one can use it without Johns Hopkins' permission. Do with it whatever you want. I don't care. But here's a map of the topography. And you can see, if this is the architectonic unit, you see that the topography shows that there is a certain hill here. But this hill is much lower than this hill, which is today the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. In the Second Temple period, it was called the higher city of Jerusalem. And it's much lower than these hills here. It is definitely lower than the hills on the eastern side of Jerusalem. And anyway, this therefore does not create the impression of a mount. You see, this is what I call the city of David. This short ridge right here is a place where you indeed, if someone was dwelling here, living here in the 1st Temple period, he would indeed climb and perhaps get an image of a mountain. But it's only for a short period of time, definitely during the 2nd Temple period. Throughout history, when the city expanded and the flat temenos or compound was created, there was no hill here. Now, who created this structure? As I said, Herod. And let's take a look at his method and go back to the slides, please. What did Herod do? Herod had a variety of reasons to engage himself in a very major, some say psychic almost, architectonic projects. He was a client of the Romans, and as such, he was depowered of any meaningful political ability to do almost anything in the ancient Near East. On the other hand, he had a lot of funds. He was collecting taxes. He was very rich. He had this inspiration to stamp his name on all sorts of building projects. There was also a need in Jerusalem because, as I said, in this area here, there was a Jewish temple. Herod wanted to create a magnitude architectonic creation. And therefore, he used Roman technology to create a flat space. Let's see the next slide, or perhaps the one after that. Now we're going underneath. We're right now underneath that structure that you've just seen before, that flat structure of the Temple Mount, and we're at the southeastern corner of that structure in a place that is today called Solomon's Stables. If you ever visit the Temple Mount, you can actually go and see those places. It has nothing to do with Solomon, and here not only the minimalists say that, it's only the name Solomon is completely irrelevant, because the architecture of these arches, as you see here, and you'll see better in my next slide, right here, this is part of the architecture. And you can see here, for example, this is typical Herodian architecture from the 1st century before the Common Era. So what Herod did, in order to flatten the mount, he used Roman technology which favored the use of arches, and he created numerous arches throughout the area and then circled the arches with the huge walls. The arches are inside here. Actually, now we're looking at the southwestern corner, and the arches that, this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the arches on the other side in this corner right here. But there are arches throughout the mountain. He created those arches, built a wall around them, part of the wall which we see here, the upper layers are actually later additions, but this part of the wall is still Herodian. This was part of a sort of a bridge or a stairway that Herod created. And then with arches inside and walls around it, all he had to do is pave on top of the arches, and you get this is part of the walls, and just to show you again, Herodian building walls on the outside, very similar to the stones that you've seen and the technique that you've seen in the arches that I showed you before. And what you get is this. This is a reproduction by a modern archaeologist and an artist, Lean Reichmeyer, of the Temple Mount of Herod. See the walls that we've just seen. We looked at this corner, and by the way, the arch that you saw is part of this stairway right here. This is the arch. It's called the Robinson Arch, following the name of the English surveyor who found it in the 19th century. And these are the walls. The arches are inside, underneath, and by doing that, he was able to create this flat unit. This is the Temple Mount. And when we refer to the Temple Mount, and the one thing that the artist wasn't able to capture here is what you have seen and witnessed with your own eyes in the previous slides. The place is much lower than it is right here. These hills to the east are much higher, and from here it is a descent. And if you ever visit Jerusalem and go to the Jewish quarter, for example, and walk through the Wailing Wall, you'll see how much you go down. It's actually going the opposite way, which makes us always sweat during the summer. Okay, so that's the unit. We have an architectonic unit. Maybe there is a hill there topographically, but definitely it's not. It cannot accommodate the image that we get when we think or imagine the term Har Habayit. When speaking of a mountain, you think of a mountain as it was produced in Jewish and Christian art throughout the generations. I'm not going to show you those slides, where it is depicted as a very steep hill with some sort of a temple, imaginary temple on its top. It is not that. Let's see if we have anything else here. I think that was the last one. Just a few more slides to show that, but I will skip that to move to my second phase, so we can shut the slides down, and I will come back to the projector in a second. So that's my first point, which is to conclude by saying that when we look for the origin of the concept behind the term Temple Mount, we need to look elsewhere, not in the topography or in the architectonic foundation. There is actually there is nothing to substantiate that there. And therefore, it would be wise to continue in discussing how that image was created. Well, let me tell you what scholars think about it, and then express some of my reservations and some of my views on this issue of where did the image originate from. One convention in the study of Jerusalem of the Roman and Byzantine period, as in the study of Judaism and Christianity of those days, is that the Temple Mount, both the spatial entity but even more the idea, has occupied Jewish consciousness from the earliest times. And when I say earliest times, I mean that is at least from the first temple period and onward. This is pretty much, I would say, almost the opposite thesis to the one that Ben Sommer rejected at first. This is an anti-minimalist, a very maximalist kind of thesis that is usually the common opinion among scholars in the study of the Temple Mount. In fact, innumerable studies apply the term Temple Mount to the temple site in discussions of events as far back as the time of ancient Israel of the First Temple and throughout the Second Temple period. The prevalent view, which I will summarize here, whether implicit or explicit, has applied to the Temple Mount and its status a model that could be named, or at least I name it, the model of sequential development. And this is a very popular research paradigm that was actually developed in that other academic institution that everyone mentions without saying its name. I'm just going by, in Rome, be a Roman. So I'm not going to mention its name south of this institution. And Mirza Eliay, one of the prestigious scholars of religion in the 20th century, has developed this model to the study of many aspects of religion, the sequential development, and it was applied to the study of the Temple Mount. Let me summarize what it entails, to put it briefly. The view suggests that the Mount in Jerusalem possessed special qualities, designated it as a unique sacred space from the earliest days of Israelite Jewish history, and that this structure and topographic elevation has retained this eminence ever since. This stature, thus goes the common wisdom, began in the first temple environment, with texts lending an aura of holiness to the site, such as, and they quote a biblical text such as Isaiah chapter 2, verse 2, who pronounces, and I quote, the mountain of the house. The mountain of the house. You see the two terms. Bet, here it's the house of the Lord. Bet Adonai. The mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established on the highest of the mountains. That's one quote. Similar pronouncements in Psalms. I quote again from 24:2. Who shall ascend? So you go up. The mountain of the Lord. And who shall stand in his holy place? Ascend, the imagery of a mountain, a holy place. Another quote from Psalms 99:9, extol the Lord our God and worship at his holy mountain. Holy mountain, so there is something there. A direct line stretches, according to this approach, from the first temple period associated with the verses, the imagery of the first temple period associated with the verses that I just quoted and many others, to the second temple period. And later, after the destruction of the second temple, the holy mountain remained, according to the common approach among scholars, as it was, its sanctity unchallenged. The subsequent stations in the mountain's story, according to this accepted approach, are first the attempt, or at least the aspiration, during the so-called Bar Kokhba revolt, which was a harsh Jewish rebellion 70 or so years after the destruction of the Second Temple. And according to this approach, the revolt was meant to restore the mount, to rebuild the temple and reestablish its ritual. So it's another station in the story of the Temple Mount, in the sacred story of the Temple Mount. And later on, when the Romans, after crushing the revolt mercilessly, the Romans established a colony known as Aelia Capitolina on the ruins of Jerusalem, and the Emperor Hadrian ordered a Capitoline temple to be erected at the precise location of the Jewish temple. The next stage in the story was the retention of the area in its destroyed state, perhaps serving as the city garbage dump, during the Byzantine period, with a short break in the 360s during one emperor by the name of Julian, who aspired to restore the pagan religion, and part of his plans was against Christianity was to restore the Temple Mount. What's important here, I'm not giving a survey for the story of the Temple Mount in modern scholarship. What's important to appreciate here that according to the sequential development view, these two reactions, the pagan and Christian, after the destruction of the Second Temple and the unsuccessful revolt of Bar Kokhba, represent two sides of the same coin. And the site's sanctity is evident also in the acts of those who tried to deny it. If the Romans wanted to build a pagan temple, it's just the other side of the coin of the sanctity of the mount. They did it because they realized and appreciated the sanctity of the place and the role it played in Jewish consciousness. The circle closes with the Arab capture of the temple compound, when it again became the city's holy site, known as the Haram. The sequential development model, thus, presents a kind of a chain consisting of 6 interlocking links. The first temple, the second temple, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, Ilia Capitolina, the Byzantine city, and the Muslim city. The thread that runs through them is the holiness ascribed to the mount, while they differ only on whether it was the ruling power implemented this sanctity positively or negatively. This is pretty much a summary of what you can find in any encyclopedia, in any textbook on the city of Jerusalem or the Temple Mount, and there are hundreds of those that were produced over the years, both in scholarly circles and here to the general public, to people who visit Jerusalem and so forth. And this was the situation that I found when I started researching this issue about 10 years ago as part of a PhD project at the Hebrew University, then turned out into a larger project and now a book. And what I'll do in the remaining time that I have is show you what I see as the major problems in this sequential development model, and then perhaps just summarize what kind of suggestion I'm trying to develop in the book. To put it bluntly, the problem with the sequential model is twofold. One is that some of the units in the sequential model actually do not exist. They're completely imaginary, and when scholars look into them carefully and check the sources and the data and the proof that survives to substantiate them, you see that they're just not there. Let me give you 2 short examples without delving too much into the discussion. The discussion is in my book. One, let's start with a more simple one, is that so-called Capitoline temple that the Romans built on the Temple Mount. I wasn't the first one, but I was definitely the one that studied this very thoroughly and was able to substantiate claims that were there, made by a few scholars, that that temple actually never existed in Jerusalem. Let's see the second one right there. No, I need the third one. I'm sorry. We'll get back to that in a second. This is the compound by Herod that you've seen before. We'll come back to that in a second. Here's a map of the current old city of Jerusalem. The sequential model claims that this site here, after the destruction of the Second Temple, was a site of a pagan temple. And when I studied this thoroughly, I've seen that this is more a product of the sequential model than a proof to substantiate it. That is, because people thought of the Temple Mount as a story of a holy site that must retain its power throughout the generations, it was the most natural place to locate the pagan temple here. This is modern scholarship, but the truth of the matter is, it is also medieval Christian authors who have created that model already in the 11th century. So when a Christian monk by the name of Xifilinus has told the story of the Bar Kokhba revolt and its consequences in the 11th century, he is the first one to say that Hadrian, after crushing that rebellion, naturally went to the place of the sacred mount and built a pagan temple right here. Now, the truth of the matter is, no such thing has ever happened. The truth is that archaeological studies and historical studies of the time show that this unit remained outside of the Roman colony of Ilia Capitolina, which was centered right here on the northwestern hill. And the pagan temple that we're talking about was exactly here, underneath what is today the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay? and which is another story for the study of Christianity, which I will not go to right now. So that's one example, and it's a simple example because it really is not related at all to what we're studying here in the conference. Now I'll take the previous one that we just took off. Let me give you a second example. This is a second example to a link that doesn't exist. This is the compound, a reconstruction of the compound that Herod built. You've seen a slide of that before. Studying Second Temple sources, and we have many Second Temple sources. We have tens of sources that were written by diverse groups, not by one group, by historians in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. Some of them in the Dead Sea were found in the Dead Sea, in what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Other were kept through Christian traditions. Other were just found in various libraries. Tens of sources. I did not find one Second Temple writer that refers to this compound by the term Temple Mount. Not even one. Nor did I find any author that even refers to this with any imagery associated with a mountain. And you can understand why. The reason are the slides that I've shown you. Someone who lived in Jerusalem and who engaged the temple, visited this area, wouldn't think about it as a mountain, because it wasn't. It was a huge compound. At the core, there was a temple to the God of Israel. Hundreds of people came here. Many of them were very much impressed and wrote their thoughts and memories down and preserved them for generations. But they never spoke of the place as the Temple Mount. What did they call it? Well, they called it the temple. Because there was a temple here. Where are you going if I meet a Second Temple Jew or a pagan visitor to Jerusalem, numerous of which indeed entered the city and wrote about the city? And you'd ask him if he's here. You see the hill. The picture doesn't capture it as good as I would like. And you would tell him, where are you going? I'm going to the temple. You'd ask him, are you going to the Temple Mount? I would think that a Second Temple Jew would look at you as if you fell out of the sky. The Temple Mount? There was no Temple Mount. So this is a very important element to understand, that another link in the chain of the sequential development is actually missing. And let me nuance this just a little bit. What did they have during the Second Temple period? Of course, they had what they called the scriptures, or what we call today the Bible. Many of those texts were either written in the Second Temple period, as we heard, at least some of them were written in the Second Temple. Many of them were much earlier than the Second Temple period, like the book of Isaiah, which I quoted from, like many of the Psalms chapters, which I quoted from. And indeed, in the First Temple period, there was an imagery of a mountain, of a sacred mountain, that was created by authors associated with the Davidic dynasty. That imagery was there, and you cannot disregard it. And the people of the Second Temple period who consumed regularly the texts of those ancient texts because they saw them as scriptures. They read them, they knew them, they related to them, so they were obviously familiar with the image. This is my nuance. They were familiar with the image, but the image did not take shape as a common usage, as a significant artifact of consciousness within their world. Okay? So even if someone read Isaiah, and if that imaginary meeting that I spoke about of two Jews, and he would tell them, are you going to the Temple Mount? He'd say, Temple Mount? I don't know what you're talking about. He said, what do you mean? What Isaiah said in Isaiah 2:2, the mountain of the Lord. He said, yeah, something of that sort. Now, how am I able to reconstruct this? Basically by reading the text. When you have numerous texts from the people of the Second Temple, and they come from different parts of the Jewish world of that time, some of them even written by non-Jews, you get the feeling. And if you do not encounter the usage of the terminology relating to this area as a mountain, you must conclude that even if that imagery existed in the background of their mind, in the scriptures that they knew, it did not play a significant role in their life. So that is the second link in the sequential story that is actually non-existent. People have said, sure, the Temple Mount started with Isaiah and the Psalms, went through the Second Temple into Hadrian and Eliay. It didn't. It did not. It's just not there. Now I'll give you a third example, which is even more problematic, the First Temple period itself. Strikingly, in the texts that represent what scholars believe to be the closest to the dynasty of David, right? We heard about the problems, maybe there wasn't even a dynasty, I'm not even going into that. But the texts that represent the closest link, that authors that were related to some sort of a dynasty that was created either by David or by people other in later generations that built this sanctuary in the First Temple period. The closest two texts that we have, according to all scholars that I know of, are the books of Samuel and Kings. The books of Samuel and Kings never mention the Temple Mount even once. Not even once. You look throughout the book of Kings, not the Temple Mount, and not other names that became part of the imagery, like Mount Moriah, never mentioned. Even another common name, Mount Zion, which people never mentioned in Samuel and Kings. On the contrary, the term Zion appears in the book of Samuel, but not as referring to this mountain. Zion was the city of Jerusalem. This is to show you that even in the earliest layers, the imagery, and I agree that in the First Temple literary material, there is an imagery in the book of Isaiah and the books of Psalms. It wasn't an integral part, at least not at first. That's my major critique against the sequential development. Now I'll add something of my own research. In my research, I found that other links that are not part of the sequential development and actually undermine that story at its very essence actually exist and were ignored by scholars. And those links cannot be put into that sequential thread that runs in the sanctity of the Temple Mount and therefore were left out or ignored from the story. I'll give you one example. When I looked for the earliest imagery of a mountain, of a sacred mountain, after Psalms and Isaiah. I say Psalms and Isaiah in the 7th, 8th century before the Common Era developed some sort of an imagery. And that was, by the way, part of a common imagery throughout the Near East, the imagery of some sort of a cosmic mountain on which temples stood in the consciousness of people in the Near East. I leave that. It is there. What after? Where is the earliest imagery of a sacred mountain in the days of the Second Temple period? I didn't find it anywhere, as I said. I found it in one place. In stories and traditions related to the early Christian movement. For example, and this is a long article of mine that was just published in the recent Harvard Theological Review issue of 2004, I published a long essay showing that this space functioned as a sacred mount in a group that is known as the Community of James, brother of Jesus. They actually, and those people who were Jews by their nature, we call them today early Christians, but there was nothing Christian. They never heard of the name Christian. They saw themselves Jews and they believed in the messianic role of Yeshua, their leader who was executed or murdered according to others. And those people who were following a figure who was known as James and claimed to be the brother of that Messiah, they identified a sacred tomb, grave of James that was located right here on the mount, actually underneath the architectonic. But the picture here is a little too neat. You saw all the arches. All the underneath of this was made out of holes, those huge holes that were created by the structures. And underneath there was a sacred tomb, which was a pilgrimage site to those people, and they believed that James, their leader, after he himself was murdered in 66, was buried there. And there are numerous traditions from the generations after the destruction of the Second Temple, that is the late 1st and early 2nd century, that actually refer to this site as a sacred mountain. The sacred mountain where James is buried. Now, those of you who are familiar with traditional Jewish purity laws know that a tomb is the most forbidden thing to have on the sacred Temple Mount. A tomb, in terms of purity laws, is the least pure and impossible to envision a tomb located here. For the Jews who believed in James, as part of their discourse, love and hate story with this institution of the temple, which I'm not going to, I've reconstructed all that in that essay at HTR, created that tomb there. That is not part of the story, the sequential development story. You see how it complicates the story, and in a way it undermines it. Because if you're talking about a traditional thread that runs through the sanctified story of the temple, a tomb, sacred, it doesn't fit in. The Jesus movement, it was left out. It was actually ignored. And I have 3 or 4 more of those, but I will save you that and go right to my conclusions. So what is my main argument in the book God's Mountain that is hopefully will come out this fall? I argue for a reconstruction of the story of the Temple Mount. You need to tell the story, but you need to tell it differently. It is not a story of sequential development. It is actually a story, the sequential development is too neat of a story. It is too traditional. It highlights the end rather than the important phases along the way. Since people at the end of the story, whether Zionists or others, have seen that as part of their tradition, the story fits that. The story is more a story of what I call a negotiating complexities. That is to say, there are various groups, especially toward the end of the Second Temple period, and even more so after the destruction of the Second Temple period, that were challenged by the lack of the Jewish temple, which was the central institution of Judaism in those times. And in order to reconfigure their identity and religion, have embraced the now destroyed space and created that imagery. The earliest ones were the followers of Jesus and James. Later on in the 2nd and 3rd century came my favorites, the rabbis. And when you read rabbinic literature, you get that a stark contradiction to the Second Temple period, where you read hundreds of texts of the Second Temple period and you don't find the Temple Mount even once. You cannot almost read a page, and definitely not a chapter of rabbinic material, that huge corpus that we call Talmudic literature, without finding the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount exists, and it is part and parcel of the imagery that the rabbis created, is part of that project to compensate or to recreate Judaism in the centuries after the Second Temple. How does that help the conference, if at all? I'm not sure. Thank you.